G'day and welcome back to the GST Junkies podcast with Stretch and Erdi. Mr. Erdi, how are you and how was your retreat?
Hello, boys and girls. Yeah, good to see you all again or speak to you all again. Retreat went really well, thanks. Just got back from the Azores. It's a collection of Portuguese islands in the Atlantic Ocean, and held a nice retreat for my for some of my students and some new people. Actually, I had some people fly from halfway across the world to come over, and I was like, damn, these guys have never even spoke to me before, and they're here spending a week with me, doing some training in the sun and eating some fish that we caught the other day. Yeah, it was a really good week. Great to have it. How are you
Nice.
doing? How's life?
Yeah, life's good, mate. Just ticking away in South Australia. So we're still in the house swap right now, which is good here until December. And the weather's starting to pick up. So a lot more ocean swimming of late, which has been good. And yeah, hoping to get some diving or some snorkeling in pretty soon, which will be awesome around this area. Lots of dolphins, lots of sea lions, lots of sharks, all the good stuff, So we'll be looking forward to that when it happens, mate. So
Yeah, I've been
enjoying the summer months.
following your stories and seeing all the dolphins swim by, and in one of the stories I'm just waiting for like a big great white fin to sort of appear out of the ocean and chase the dolphins.
Yeah, that's it, mate.
Or
That's
maybe
it.
the other way around. I think the dolphins chase them. I'm not sure.
We're told the sharks don't come in this close, but it'll be interesting to see. So we can go diving here safely, apparently. But my brother-in-law, he's got a boat, and we get the tuna run. The tuna run comes around the southern point of Australia, sort of around Christmas time. And last year he was out there fishing for tuna, and he's got video footage of like a great white swimming around his boat, probably 4.5 meter. And then about 20 minutes later, he had this mako chewing on the propeller of his boat. It was a good 4.5 meter mako as well. So they're definitely out there.
Love it. I got to try and make it down for tuna season. I just missed the one in the Azores.
Yeah, that's it, mate. Oh, when you get back to Oz and you escape that UK winter, you're more than welcome to come and do some diving with us, mate.
Love it. I'll be there.
That'll be good. Anyway, we better switch tone and talk about today's topic. We're going to talk a little bit about flexibility secrets.
Oh, secrets of flexibility. I know.
We're sort of chatting before the podcast and saying, well, is there any secrets? Does everyone already know everything we already know? Are we the right people to share any knowledge that people don't know? But I suppose it really depends on who's tuning in and who's listening.
Yeah, I always feel like sometimes when you get so stuck into your own thoughts and your own world and the things that you're researching and studying, that you just expect everyone else to know the same thing, and you have this like hesitancy to share things because you're like, oh yeah, people already know this, surely. But then you take a step back and you realize, oh wait a minute, no one spent the last 10 hours looking at these topics the same way that I have because they're just not as interested in it as I am, and they've probably looked at something else. So we probably do have some good secrets or when I say secrets, like unfamiliar or like less common flexibility methods, or let's say like hacks. I don't like to use the word hacks, but little tips and tricks that people can incorporate into their practice that they might not have come across if they were to just take their flexibility knowledge from generic sort of social media content. There's a few layers a bit deeper than that, which sometimes can be harder to portray on social media, or which just hasn't caught up in the industry just yet. So I feel like what we have to offer today should help maybe some more like beginner coaches in the flexibility world, and definitely anyone who's just the flexibility practitioner and is a bit more self-taught with this stuff.
Yeah, no, I like what you said there. I think in the industry, it's something that's still, it's been around for a few years now. It's been evolving a lot since maybe early 2000s. Flexibility's really started to appear more and more. But like I look back at my career and sort of think about, with personal training and coaching, even owning the gym, we spent a lot of time researching strength and conditioning and doing a lot of that sort of stuff. And flexibility was really put on the back burner for so long. And it wasn't until I started doing more flexibility myself that I was like, oh, what why didn't I know this sooner? And why didn't I have an understanding of how this worked? And it's sort of funny now because you go back and think about all the strength stuff and how a lot of this would have made a big difference in maybe how I coached or some of the things I did when I was in the early years of my PT, or even at times, owning the gym and writing the programming for the clients and the members, like actually adding in more flexibility or really focusing in maybe on some of the strength exercises, not chasing weight, but chasing range of motion and stuff like that. So I think it'll be a good topic. I'm keen to chat about it and hear some of your dirty secrets, mate, and share some of mine. It'll be great.
Sounds good to me. But yeah, no,
Yeah.
agreed. There's much more of an accessible framework for strength, whereas when it comes to flexibility, it's like, oh, let's just do this stretch and this stretch. It's the equivalent of like, someone saying, oh, I want to get stronger here, and you're like, oh, just do this exercise and do this exercise, but without like, the concept of periodization or progression over time.
Yeah, 100%. I think that leads in nicely to like, if we start talking about maybe the tight hip flexors and we talk about the couch stretch a little bit, I think a lot of adults have tight hip flexors because we spend a lot of time seated. And, this can lead to back pain, or it can lead to hip pain, or it can lead to lots of sort of different things we see in the anterior pelvic tilt or all that sort of stuff. And, you might go to a physio or you might work with a PT and they'll be telling you that you've got to do the couch stretch or stretch your hip flexors. But something that we don't sort of know, or something I didn't know when we first started doing, more sort of couch stretch, it was like, okay, you need a certain level of flexibility in your quads before you'll even get deeper into the layers of the deep flexor muscles. So, we talked about this offline before we started. It's like, flexibility is a lot like peeling an onion. There are multiple layers. And if you don't address the outer layer, then you're not going to get deeper into the inner layers. And you could be spending a lot of time, in the couch stretch or using something like the couch stretch and actually never get deep into the deep flexor muscles that might be causing pain, discomfort, bad posture, whatever it is that you're trying to resolve. But with the right knowledge, understanding about how to stretch the quads, and then when you're ready to start stretching the hip flexors and the variation in different exercises, even variations within the couch stretch itself, to sort of target different muscles. And that was sort of like the example that, we thought we'd just sort of open with, to give people a little bit of an idea about, okay, well, what are these secrets, or what is the information that I might get from, tuning into this podcast. So if you didn't know that, there's number one, first tip for you.
Yeah, it was a 2017, I think it was, when I did my workshop with Emmett Louis, the flexibility guru online at the moment. And he introduced the concept of deeper muscles harder to access if the surface muscles are kind of creating any resistance or apprehension, or if they're a bit tighter or even potentially weaker, the body won't let you get to the deeper ranges that much easier. So yeah, we were covering the front splits, and obviously for the front splits, we're looking for good hip extension on the back leg, and for good hip extension, then we need sort of flexible hip flexors, and we need those hip flexors to kind of be like loose enough, but also strong enough in their ranges to support that. But before we did any of that, he was like, cool, so what we're going to do is we're going to stretch the quad. And as we know, the quad is it gets stretched when the knee is in full flexion. So I think if you bring your heel to your bum, this is you stretching the quad, but it's not the same mechanical movement that you would use in a front split. In a front split, you'd have the back leg straight. So it's like, oh, this is interesting. Why are we doing like a bent knee stretch for what's essentially a straight leg stretch, the front split? And he explained, once we release these surface layer quad muscles, then it will be easier to get to the deeper muscle, the hip flexors underneath those quads. And I actually tested it after that workshop a few times without doing the surface layer stretching first. So without stretching the quads, I just tried to get into the deeper hip flexor stretches, and the stretch was in a very different sensation, in a different place in my leg if I did it that way. Whereas if I sort of stretched the quad first and then I tried to stretch the hip flexor, I could feel like the stretch being much higher and closer to the top of the hip and like to the lower abdomen area, which is where like the psoas and the iliac, I think it's called,
Yep.
also sit. So yeah, that was that was a big eye opener. I was like, oh wow, so there is a bit of complexity to this stretching nonsense, and there's something going on here which I had no idea about, and it was quite good to see.
Yeah, 100%, mate. I think my first sort of look into some of this that really made the coin drop for me was actually at a Poliquin workshop. And I'm just trying to think whether it was Derek Woodsky teaching it or whether it was Charles. But anyway, we were talking about glute activation and we were talking about hip extension. So it's like, squats and deadlifts and RDLs and all this sort of stuff are great for working the glutes. But if the hip flexors are tight, then the glutes can't fire correctly, or you can't get maximum contraction out of the glutes because the hips can't extend. So the hamstring, which is a synergist muscle that supports hip extension, becomes the primary driver of hip extension. So therefore it can overwork the hamstring. And you often see this in something like a hip bridge where people feel their hamstrings doing most of the work. So they're doing hip bridges, which should be predominantly more sort of glute, but their hamstrings are on fire. And then it was like, okay, but if we stretch the quads and we stretch the hip flexors before we do the hip extension exercise, then we start to get an more open range of motion, and we're going to get better activation through the glutes. So then the approach that we were using then was, okay, we're going to do split squats and RDLs as a good superset, because the split squat, let's say it's a progression towards the front splits, as you sort of mentioned, and the idea is to try to keep that back leg nice and straight and take that hip into good extension. So we're lengthening the hip flexors in that split squat, and then we're moving into an RDL, which is the chance to hit the posterior chain and strengthen the glutes as hip extenders. And that was a big sort of penny drop for me with a lot of stuff, because it's like, well, if we can do that at the hip joint, we can obviously do the same at every other joint when we think about the tightness in certain muscles and the weakness in the muscle on the other side.
I remember
a lot to this.
I remember you recommending me that exact superset, split squats and RDLs, and this was probably fucking 5 or 6 years ago. And I was like, oh yeah, I'd never considered it that way. It must have been just after you had done this workshop that you mentioned, or this
Yeah. It's probably
seminar.
10 years ago now, mate. It's a scary thing.
Is it close to 10? Oh, no, but yeah, it was a long time ago. Yeah, I wanted to very quickly touch on the concept of like adults sitting down too much and that being the cause of their hip flexors tightening. I because I used to think the same. As time passed, I started thinking of it a little bit differently and thinking it's not necessarily the sitting down, but it's like the lack of not doing the other things. Because there's also lots of coaches, like I say coaches, lots of people who sit down a lot but won't have issues with their hip flexors, and it's because they continue training the glutes and the hip flexors. They have an active lifestyle, which is what we would have had, a century ago. We would have had more of an active lifestyle. I think like a century ago, we only had like 10% of the population was like of the working population was indoors, whereas 90% was outdoors. Whereas now it's like almost the opposite, right? So this is why we need things like gyms and training practices and this and that, etc. to kind of like keep the body supple and physical. So yeah, I've basically I'm not saying it's wrong or right or whatever, but I don't like to basically blame people for sitting down because it's almost impossible. I rather blame them for not training properly.
It's a fair
Get back
approach.
to the gym.
I don't disagree with you there. The combination of the two, like say, you can get away with sitting and doing a lot of sitting as long as you're doing a lot of physical activity around that. But if you're not doing any physical activity, then sitting's probably not the best thing for you. So
that's it. Go do some training. Get to the gym.
Go do some training. Let's dig into the training environment, mate. When we're talking about flexibility and we're talking about the training environment, what are some things that you think are going to help us get the most out of our flexibility sessions?
Yeah, this was a big one. I find stretching to be really sensitive to where you are, but also importantly, like anything, like you could walk into a really good gym for like a bodybuilding gym. You're like, damn, like without even training, like you're gonna feel like you've got a pump, right? And then you can walk into like a little hotel gym and you look around, you're like, I don't really want to train in here. Like you have to work really hard to like make any decent sort of session happen. So you got like that sort of external environment in a way of sort of like where you're at. And I think with training, with stretching, that can be, it can be similar. Like any training modality, if you're stretching with other people who are also stretching, you're probably going to get a bit more out of it. Or if you're in that type of environment where people appreciate it. Whereas if you're in an environment like a bodybuilding gym and you're trying to stretch secretly in the corner, but you don't want people to see you stretching because you feel a bit nervous about it, it's going to be like, oh, you're probably not really going to get much out of your practice, because you're a bit apprehensive and a bit nervous. But this is not like this is the case for any situation, any training modality. You can't go play tennis in a football court. It's just you're not gonna feel right, and it's not gonna work. But then what makes the flexibility one a bit more interesting is the actual surfaces that we're training on. So I noticed this when I walked in. Actually, I walked into a gym in London a few years ago, and the floor in this gym was just like this weird soft but also firm floor. And I'd seen loads of trainers in this gym before, kind of like sitting in pancakes, sitting in splits quite comfortably, etc. And as soon as I walked in barefoot and I like sat on the floor, I had like an extra 10 to 15 degrees of range in my I think it was in my pancake at the time, and I was like, this is interesting. And then I went into the middle split, and that was a lot lower, and I went into front split, and that was a lot more comfortable. And I was like, this gym floor is just built for flexibility. Like it's just a great flooring for this stretching. So then I played with it a little bit more in terms of my own practice, and I tried stretching on different surfaces. I actually unlocked my middle splits by training it on the sand beach versus training it on like hard flooring trainers. Yeah, just having a different surface, something that was a bit softer. Apparently, if we look at the science, it's got to do with the apprehension reflex, or of the stretch reflex, or to do with the stretch reflex, and it just helps reduce it. So having a softer surface basically allows your body to feel like it's not going to be in pain as the skin touches the floor, and you can support yourself easier and get into ranges easier as a byproduct.
Yeah, nice, man. Every gym should have a sandpit in it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Could you imagine the mess?
If I ever open a new gym, it's gonna have a sandpit, guaranteed.
Yeah, that's it, mate. I was surprised too because, most of the time in Queensland when I built the shed and I was training there, like it's too hot to train out in the sun, so you're in the shade of the shed, and I've just got your typical, rubber gym mats. They're okay to stretch on, but then when I was traveling, I was doing some stretching, and I was on a football field and it was all grass, so I was just doing stretching on the grass, and it made a big difference just going between the soft grass and the hard rubber mats. So yeah, the surface is definitely something to consider when you're working on your flexibility. I think it's also like you talked about there, the apprehension reflex. I think that comes down to a little bit to do with like our breathing as well, and our nervous system. So if you've had a day, one of those days where you're quite stressed and everything's going crazy and you've just been running around, like your flexibility, if you just go straight into it, it's going to take you a lot longer to get certain ranges of motion. But just being able to calm that nervous system and work on the breath, go a little bit internal, I think that can make a big difference as well, between sort of being highly stressed or being more sort of parasympathetic. Is there anything else you reckon that you found in terms of yourself or your clients have found in and around the environment that they're doing their flexibility training?
Yeah, it's like when they agreed with you on the breathing. By the way, that's yeah, it's a good point. If somebody's coming in pretty stressed into like a heavy stretch session, it's not always going to work too well. The body's kind of ready to fire up and contract. First, kind of like let loose and relax. When hitting plateaus, if somebody's hit a middle split plateau, I recommend them to just change surface. I say, okay, let's get you onto grass, or let's get you onto a slidey surface with socks. Or if they've been on a slidey surface with socks, I'm like, okay, now let's get you into some trainers. I'll try and change the surface or the texture that they have between their feet and the surface, for example, in a middle split, to help break plateaus, and it can usually work. And There's also another interesting one. Have you ever tried stretching on your bed? So
No, I don't think so, mate. No, it hasn't really
yeah,
appealed to me, or I haven't really thought about it. No,
I,
get the
I
mattress set.
managed. Yeah, I managed to get into like one of my best ever front splits by doing it on the bed, which is quite interesting. Um, I haven't experimented with that one too much, but again, you've got like the idea that you're in like a comfortable, safe space. It's obviously pretty soft, and you can use a lot of support from like the blankets and the pillows and things like this as well. But
Is that some
I
sort
remember.
of crazy Kama Sutra position, or?
No, I was there by myself. I mean, I suppose it could still be Kama Sutra by yourself, but it was in one of the Airbnbs in Australia. Actually, it was down in oh, I forgot what it was called, down in Central Coast,
Yeah.
Bateau Bay. Really nice. It was just a really nice bed, really nice Airbnb, and I was like, I just like slid into this front split, and it was one of the best front splits I'd ever done. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't played with it much more since then, but yeah, different surface, different
Yeah.
environment.
Were you enclosed at the time, mate, or is that something
Felt,
else that affects affects your flexibility gains?
felt like you're very curious. We should probably set up a little workshop for you. Give you a
What
special
happened on
rate.
this retreat of yours, mate?
Yeah, but no, different surfaces, different environments can make a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like, obviously, I mean, some people can probably listen to heavy metal and do flexibility, but I think most of the time you want to be trying to calm that nervous system as much as you possibly can, and
Yeah,
try to relax into it, especially if you're doing a lot of the long sort of holds and stuff like that.
yeah,
So it can
yeah.
make a
This is
big
the thing.
difference. Yeah.
Like sorry, yeah, you're going for like those long passivy type holds where you're trying to relax into a stretch. 100%. Like I've had friends in the past, or specifically a coach in the past, who would play heavy metal, put himself on like the most intense surface that's going to give him the most like struggle for his strength, and that's how he would progress with his flexibility with his middle splits. It was quite interesting. Have you? Did you ever like see Juji Mufu's like flexibility programming, or he had a book on
I really
on?
know. Obviously, I follow him on Instagram, but then I see
Yeah.
his crazy flexibility, but I've not seen his book. No.
So years ago, he released a book for flexibility development. I think specifically in the middle splits. I don't know if there was many other ranges in there, but like it basically geared towards the very intense type of stretching. So like imagine like hyping yourself up for like a 1 to 3 RM and like doing 8 to 12 sets of this or whatever it is of this like low rep high intensity workout for strength work, like let's say squats or bench press. It was basically like that. It was like heavy powerlifting but for flexibility from what I understand. So you do have like two ends of the spectrum with this stuff as well, which I find quite interesting. I don't think there's like a one size fits all, and you do kind of need to experiment a little bit, see what you gear towards a little bit better. But for most people, like at the beginning, stuff like that's just going to ruin them a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go hard. The go hard or go home mentality is a good way to break yourself in flexibility training, I think.
Yeah, or smash some PBs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It's funny you mentioned that, mate, because I've been working back towards my head to toe. Like I strained my hamstring a little while back when I was working sort of head to toe, and I was going hard at the intensity. So it was like, a couple of times a week, really just trying to work that deep range of motion, and pushing for more range of motion. And I got quite close. I think I was only like two fingers away from head to toe, and then I had to rest it because that right hamstring just got a bit of a strain. So it's taken a few months to sort of rehab that and get back to this point. But then for the last 2 weeks, I've just been working on elbow to toe and my cold flexibility of like, okay, can I touch my elbow to toe, and how long does it take me to touch my elbow to toe? Doing it every day. So it's like I'm doing 3 sets of 72 pulses on each side, which is an Emmett Lewis program. And then the first day, it wasn't until the second set, maybe halfway through the second set on both sides, that I touched elbow to toe. And then 14 days later, so today, I did in the first set 6 pulses and my elbow was already at my toe. And it's not like I'm fighting for the deepest range. I am feeling a good stretch, and there's a different sensation that's already starting to happen, which is really, really good. But my goal here is just, okay, I'm going to work on my cold flexibility. My goal is, okay, can I get elbow to toe 3 days in a row on the first rep of the first set? and then I'm going to go, okay, now I'm going to step up and go to the next level. But it's like stepping back on the intensity, not pushing to the end range, but increasing the volume and frequency, just to try and come at it from a different way to see if it's going to help me progress towards the head to toe. And I think that's like a good approach for me, considering I strained my hamstring last time around, probably doing the juju, go hard or go home mentality, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, this is a good example of like the difference in frequency when you change the intensity, right? Like if you're going pretty hard, you generally need to have a lot less frequency, just like powerlifting, strength training. Because I've heard of other people sort of like stagnating with going hard on the head to toe training before as well. And I've heard of other people just not getting any gains with like the slow and steady one, and they would need to go hard. I've had a few people in the past be like, if you have to pulse like you mean it, and then in someone in your case is like, well, if I pulse like I mean it, it causes some trouble. And then you've got the other spectrum, which is I could just do it every single day, but at an intensity which is tolerable. So that you don't feel like you need to recover mentally or physically anywhere near as hard. And you can probably achieve the same, if not better, results by doing this method. It does take a bit more time, for sure. But if you're staying injury-free and you're staying like pain-free, and it's just for you an easier way to manage your resources, then it's a much better way to do it. I never did it daily like yourself, especially not for that many. I think my max I ever did was like 3 by 30 reps or 3 by 30 pulses. And I was doing it about once every other day. It was like 2 to 3 times a week. But for me, that just seemed enough. I'm not saying that's what everyone needs. I'm just saying, like, for me, that was enough. Whereas some people like yourself, and I've seen other people online at the moment saying they had to do it every day, 72 pulses for a few sets. And then the opposite spectrum, like once or twice a week, but just going super hard.
Yeah, exactly, mate. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. Like, there's intensity, volume, and frequency. It's something to manage. Like, we know to manage intensity, volume, and frequency with a lot of our strength training, but I don't think we've really put a lot of thought into that around flexibility training. It's like, just do a few stretches here and do a few stretches there, or I can push it every session, new ranges of motion, and just keep fighting. And eventually I'm going to open up these ranges of motion. But I think, like I said, there's times for the intensity to be high and really be fighting for it. And there's other times when we just got to back it off maybe and work more volume, work more frequency, and periodize our training. Or like you said before, it's like different approaches, different surfaces can make a difference. Different training volumes, frequency, intensity can make a difference. It's sort of finding what works for the individual.
If anyone doesn't know, sorry about the head to toe stuff, I realize we went off on a tangent there. Just YouTube Emmett Louis head to toe, and I think he's got like 2 to 3 videos on that, including how to program for it and how to do the reps safely. But yeah, he's got some good videos on YouTube.
Yeah, 100%, mate. Yeah, well, that's where I sort of stole this idea from. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to back it off, and it's something I want to do. I can do every day, and it's still a goal I want to achieve, and it's just a nice part of my warm-up. It's the first thing I do for every session at the moment. And then even on a rest day, it's just like, okay, well, just going to, before I start work, I just get in and do those pulses and just get it done. So,
yeah. Sounds great.
Good habit to build, mate.
So, what's our next tip for the audience?
I think like just one thing before we move into the next thing, maybe sort of share some methods and ideas. Have you had clients or have you experienced yourself, besides injury? Obviously, injury is one of those things that's going to make us step back. But have you had clients maybe regress with their flexibility? So things are going well, and then all of a sudden they're not at the level where they were before. Like they actually go backwards. Have you experienced that yourself, or seen people experience that?
Yeah, this can happen. I mean, you've got injuries, and then you've got like small underlying strains which you don't really notice, or you do like a session which takes its toll a little bit harder than the previous one, and you don't realize that you still need a bit more recovery for it. So this is like a bit more short term to what you're describing there. So I can use myself as an example here because I've done this loads of times. Let's say I'm training middle splits once a week, and I'm the type of person at the moment with my middle splits training where I do go hard or go home. So I'll go in for like a pretty hard set, up to 2 or 3 times. And sometimes, if I'm having a really good day, I will do an extra 1 or 2 sets. And instead of like just leaving it as it is, I'll do that. And it's taken me a while to learn this. And then what I used to do was I used to then try and have the same amount of recovery before I did my next session, which would be 5 to 7 days. I would do my middle split session again, and I could not get anywhere near the same range of the same performance as I did the previous session. Like, what's going on? It took me a while to realize it's just because I threw in some extra reps at this deep range that I'm not used to holding for very long. So I've gone from having like 20 to 30 seconds time under tension in my max range middle split to having almost 2 minutes, which is like, it's like a 400% increase in one session just because I'm having a good day. So then obviously the body's freaking out and it's like it can't maintain that performance over the same amount of recovery. So it's something where you have to manage your expectations and be like, okay, so in my next session, I'm going to need to back off a little bit. And probably for maybe even the next session after that, I still shouldn't expect to reach what I had on that good day. Because sometimes some things just happen and stars align right and the moon is perfect. You got the best tides and you just hit your ranges like they're super easy. Doesn't mean they're unlocked, and it definitely doesn't mean you now have access to them. What it means is you've peaked. And you've peaked pretty hard, and you've now trained more than normal in your peak because you're so excited about these new ranges. So you're going to have to wait for longer before you can get back to your normal training. And I've had this with students quite often, and I had it with myself with the middle splits loads. It was always like 1 step forward, 2 steps back with the middle splits for me, because I kept what I would call binge training. It's like you have a good day and you just go for it and you smash it, and then you have to pay the price.
Yeah, no, it's a good insight to have, mate. I think it's one of those things, isn't it? We don't go to the gym every week and test our 1RM back squat because we know that if we keep applying that level of intensity, it is eventually going to start to go backwards. And flexibility can be the same. I think it's worth noting that flexibility training isn't linear. I've definitely seen clients that are making good progress, and then all of a sudden, it could be a few weeks where they just seem to go backwards a little bit. But then when you talk to them about their lifestyle, work's really busy at the moment. I've been really stressed, haven't been sleeping well, and all these other lifestyle factors come into play, and it's just like, well, it's probably affecting your flexibility and your stretching. So just do what you can right now, and then when the stress drops off, or when sleep improves, or when you start eating well and this, that, the other, you'll start to get back the range you had and start making progress again.
Yeah, and this is why a lot of people aren't very well suited for the go hard or go home method. Basically, the lifestyle factors will get in the way without them realizing. Like, it's just inevitable. The average person will run into bumps and humps here and there where they can't manage their recovery sustainably each week to then produce the same result. So they're much better off working in like a 70 to 80% 1RM sort of intensity if we compare it to RPE or whatever training and powerlifting or strength training. Because it's the exact same way that most of your clients won't respond well to doing 1RM training in their strength work. Every week they will need to work in that 60 to 80, 70% range because it's just the more sustainable one to recover from. It leaves them extra resources in the bank so that when life does hit, because life will hit for most people, kids keeping me up at night, bosses being a dick at work, the wife's being a dick or the husband's being a dick in at home, whichever, I don't know, but you all get stresses. Weddings will come up, parties will come up.
Your missus is not in your ear's reach right now, is she?
No, she's not. But it can be either or, right? Husband or wife, or either side of the partner, whichever. And these things will get in the way, and it will affect your training. This is why it's for most people, like the average person, and this sort of programming comes to more than. But it shows that strength and flexibility are quite similar in their sensitivities. Most people will need to manage their intensity and volume appropriately, as if they're not, because they're not athletes. They can't train like athletes, so they need to leave available recovery resources.
Yeah, exactly. Managing the resources, 100%.
Yeah.
I think, we've done well. We've talked about the environment here, given people some ideas around that. We've sort of covered a little bit around volume, intensity, and frequency, and sort of understanding how obviously that has an impact. Let's move into methods of stretching. What's some of your favorite, or what's one of your favorite sort of methods for improving flexibility?
Methods for stretching. So the one that I use the mostly at the moment is the reciprocal inhibition. I think we spoke about this in some of the previous episodes. I can't remember now,
Yeah.
but basically, to put it as my friend Tom puts, strengthen then lengthen. So it's like you pick a range that you're trying to improve. We'll go for the hamstrings, like forward fold as the most obvious one. Everyone knows about trying to touch your toes. Standing upright, legs straight, try and touch your toes. One side of the chain is shortening, one side of the chain is lengthening. So the shortening side is the one that you try and strengthen, and the lengthening side is the one you try and lengthen. So then, taking this principle, what I do is I give people supersets. So they will superset a strength exercise for shortening the shortening side or contracting the shortening side, and then they have a bit more of like a loaded, or not loaded, a bit more of a lengthening stretching exercise for the hamstrings, so the other side, the one that's lengthening. So for example, it could be like a seated pike compression as a very basic example. You sit on the floor, hands on either side of your legs, and you're trying to, over your knees, straight legs, and you're trying to lift your feet off the floor. So you have to, having to contract the abs, the hip flexors, the quads. This is your strengthening exercise. You're shortening the chain actively. And then you'll go into a Jefferson curl where you're lengthening through the posterior chain. And this is your superset. You'll have about 30 seconds rest after the first exercise, because this way you'll still reap the benefits of the contraction of the shortening side. So what it does is it helps reduce your stretch reflex and apprehension reflex. And then you go straight into your lengthening exercise, and then you have a good 90 seconds to 2 minutes rest, and then you go again. So this is my favorite method for building flexibility as like the base layer of how I like to program.
Yeah, awesome, mate. It's the working of the agonist-antagonist sort of idea, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Supersetting agonist and antagonist muscle groups.
Yeah, exactly. I like that example, like the forward fold, working the flexibility of the posterior chain, like you say, and shortening the anterior one. And like you said, you can sort of do that with any flexibility exercise. One of the other ones I think we do a lot of is like the Tailor pose. So you're sitting back to wall, you've got the soles of your feet together, you're allowing your knees to drop out to the side, and you're trying to stretch adductors, inner thigh muscles. So this could be the stretching side, just trying to stretch those muscles, and then you could superset that with like a quadrupedal hip abduction exercise. So you're kneeling on all fours, and the knees are bent, and then you're just lifting one leg out to the side. So abducting the hip and lifting that leg up. So that's strengthening the opposite muscle, which is the glutes, is another one we can look at if you want some sort of examples around that. But yeah, the touch your toes one is probably the most common one when we talk about that method of stretching. If that's your go-to, what's your second go-to? What's another method you like?
Second go-to. That's the main one that I'll use, and then you've got ballistics, but we've spoke about ballistics already, and I don't use them lightly. I don't give ballistics to everyone, but it is one that I really like once the practitioner is sort of ready. To be fair, I use superset antagonist-agonist for pretty much everyone, almost all the way to their full range. Like there'll be things in their phase, like over the 2 to 3 years, where we'll add in a little incentive in their stretching. So it's like, oh, let's give you a target, for example. But like you're still focusing on the lengthening aspect when you give someone a target stretch. So you'll still give them the active shortening. So okay, let's give an example here. So it's not just lots of jargon. We'll stick with the same example, like the forward fold. So you've got your forward fold. You've just done the strengthening side that we spoke about. You've done your pike compressions, but now instead of doing a Jefferson curl, you're doing a seated pike. So you're sitting on the floor. You're sitting facing the wall. So you got like your feet up close to the wall, and now you're reaching. You're trying to touch your fingertips to the wall. So this is what we call like target-based stretching. You're giving your brain a target to complete. Now this is still sticking with the agonist antagonist superset, but instead in the stretching of the antagonist, stretching of the hamstrings, we're just giving the brain a bit more of a physical target to reach and overcome. And then by doing this, it allows the brain to problem solve. We're really good problem solvers, and the body will just magically basically give you a bit of extra range. So this can be like one of the techniques I like to use, within that type of methodology to help get somebody deeper into a range.
Yeah, awesome, mate. I like the target and the targeted idea because it's like, you know, flexibility can sometimes be one of those things like, am I making progress? How do I know I'm making progress? And yeah, videos are great. We can use videos. But even like within the session, you can see that you're making progress. And if you use something like a target, like let's say that seated touch the wall sort of thing, if you're seated in a pike, legs are straight out in front of you and reaching towards the wall and you can't touch it, and then you reach again and you can touch it lightly, and then you can reach again and you can put more pressure into it. And as the session goes on, maybe you'll get to a point where you can make fists and you can touch the wall. So you know that, okay, these sets and reps I'm doing, I am actually seeing progress here with these target reaches. And what I also like about the target is it keeps us honest. So I think sometimes when we're stretching, we're like, oh yeah, there's a stretch, I'll back out of it. Oh, there's a stretch, I'll back out of it. Is every rep the same, or is there every rep to the same intensity? And when we've got a target to aim for, we've got that ability to sort of measure and make sure the rep is equal to the last rep or the rep is greater than the last rep, because we've got that physical target that we're reaching and touching for, which is something that I've used a lot in my own training and something I use with clients as well. And I think it's a great way to sort of progress and measure and test progress in different variations of flexibility.
Yeah, target stretching works wonders. You were talking about it like you do it at the moment with your elbow to toe.
Yeah.
Like basically your elbow touching your toe is the target, and you got it in 6 pulses today, which is really nice. That's a really good sign that your body is getting better at reaching the target. Like the fact that, okay, you might not be going much deeper, but you're measuring it by knowing that you can reach that target earlier and earlier each week.
Yeah. It's the idea of cold flexibility. It's like, okay, if I do a warm up and then I do a hyper stretching and then I can finally touch my elbow to my target, okay, this is good. But what's the cold flexibility? What's just walking into the gym and just going, okay, can I get my elbow to touch my targets, my toes straight away without any warm up, without any sort of prerequisite to that, just going? And if we can improve like our cold flexibility, that's going to have carryover into greater ranges of motion when we are warm and when we have done a few reps, which it shows already. Like my second and third set of pulses, my elbow goes past the toe, like I'm touching the yoga block, which my foot is elevated on right now. So the range is definitely getting better, but I'm not chasing it in terms of, okay, now I'm going to make this harder and try to go. I'm not really trying to go lower. Like, let's say, okay, take the elbow out of the way. Now can I get my head to touch my fist on top of my toe, because that's a lower target? It's just like accepting, okay, this range is great, but I'm still just working on the cold flexibility, not chasing a higher intensity on that just now. So I do like that. You mentioned there, obviously I'm doing pulsing reps, I'm doing ballistic reps at the moment with this, so it's like touch again, touch again. You were saying that you don't use it that often and you sort of wait until a client's ready. What's a tell sign, or what's a prerequisite before you put ballistics in?
Yeah, so I don't really have like checkpoints in the same way that I would with some of my like strength work for this. It's a bit more along the lines of, can I trust this person to gauge their own intensity and gauge their own body in terms of how they're feeling? Can I trust them to back off if they need to back off, and to push when I feel like they need to push? Because obviously I can't be there for every rep to help them with this, if that makes sense. But also, did I just have some like time, like what do you call it? Some like time under their belt? Is that the phrase? Do they have like some years in the game, some like some experience in the field of stretching, or are they kind of new to this and they're still figuring out the positions? Because when you're doing ballistic stretching, you kind of need the body to organize itself properly for things to work in the direction that you need them to work, but also for muscles to get out of the way in the way that you need them to get out of the way to help you get a bit deeper, and to pull and not pull at the right times. And usually beginners just won't have this knowledge. Like that they're only just figuring out, that how to activate their hip flexors or lift their knee up beyond their hip level. Like, you can't really risk kind of giving them head to toe pulses or anything like this, because the body just isn't moving to their favor. So if we do use head to toe as an example, what we're looking at is we're looking at trying to get the head to the toe, but that means that we want the spine to be lengthened down the leg as best as possible. Now, if their hip isn't hinging, what's going to end up happening is, like, the lower spine isn't going to be folding over the legs. Instead, it's going to be protruding out perpendicular to the legs. Perpendicular. And then the top of the spine is going to be flexing down, because that's all the person knows how to flex. So now you're trying to do pulses, but while like a higher leverage point from the base of the spine. And I don't want to sit here and say it's going to cause injury, but it's just not going to be an optimal way of stretching through the hamstrings. Whereas if we can get this person to fold nicely first, and they can have a good hip hinge, and we know that they can monitor themselves and their own progress and their own, like, intensity, and they can do it safely because they have a bit of what we call, like, training maturity, or like some training wisdom. They know when to back off and push when they need to. Then we can say, okay, you know what? Let's do it. Let's try some pulses. So I'll normally put it in as like a test. Sometimes if I feel like someone's ready for pulsing, I'll throw it into their program, and I'll be very clear in the notes, and I'll leave them some voice notes as well. I don't want you to push this. I just want you to start with some light pulsing, and let's see how this progresses. I'll get them to send me some videos. I'll get some feedback after the first 6 weeks, and if I feel like they're sensible enough to continue, I'm like, cool. Let's give this to you on like a slightly harder intensity.
Yeah. No, I agree with you there. It's an interesting one. It'd be cool to be able to sort of have maybe some prerequisites. Like, obviously, we've talked about this before too. Like the Jefferson curl, the prerequisite should be being able to hinge at the hips, let's say a split stance RDL, and get the torso parallel to the floor. So showing that you've got good anterior pelvic tilt before you start to round the spine and go deeper into Jefferson curls, because what you just sort of said again, the point of flexion in the spine is going to be higher up, and it's not going to get the best results in terms of flexibility there. And the same sort of thing here in the head to toe. And then, like you sort of said, it's that pulling in the pulses. So when we're talking agonist, antagonist, okay, we're stretching the hamstring, but the objective is to activate the hip flexors to contract them and pull deeper into that forward fold. And it's interesting because right now, after doing this for multiple days, the thing that's the sorest for me is my hip flexors. Like, that's where I'm feeling it these days. And even though I'm stretching the hamstrings, like the next day I'm like, man, my hamstrings feel fine and I can handle this frequency and volume of stretching that, but my hip flexors is like, oh geez, I definitely know I've been contracting those bad boys. So
that's a good sign. Your hip flexors are getting a bit more active, and they're in a position where they can actually work. Yeah,
that's it, mate. Hip flexors are getting buff gains.
exactly. Yeah. Whereas
another thing I've been experimenting with lately, and I found to be quite cool, is the bent joint to straight joint. And I think a common example here is we see the squat to pike. So you're starting in a squat position with your feet obviously sort of in your squat stance, so you can get your hips down nice and low. And then in that squat position, you're feeling that the belly is touching the thighs because you're deep in that squat. And then the objective here is you start to straighten the legs, but you try to maintain that connection. So the belly is touching the thighs, and you start to push the knees back, and you work that into a point where you feel a deep stretch in the hamstrings. So you don't have to straighten the legs all the way here. It's just working that stretch and wherever that is for you. What that does is it sets the pelvis in that anterior pelvic tilt because we're deep in the squat. And then you're trying to stretch the hamstrings while the pelvis stays in that anterior pelvic tilt because the stomach is still touching the thighs in that position. And it just offers a different sort of stretch compared to, let's say, starting with the legs straight and then trying to fold yourself down into the forward fold or into the pike, because you need to have a certain range of anterior pelvic tilt to get to that level. So it's nearly attacking it from the opposite end of the stretch. So you've got the top-down approach, but this is sort of like the bottom-up approach. So when we're in that squat, again, another way to think about it is when we're in the squat, the hamstrings are relaxed. So it allows the pelvis to tilt forward. If the hamstrings are already on stretch, then we can't tilt the pelvis forward anymore because the hamstrings are pulling the back of the pelvis down. So it's just a different way to do that. But then I was thinking the other day, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to work on like stretching my biceps and my pecs. And we do a lot of shoulder extension stuff. So we could think German hang. We could think holding a stick behind our back and lifting the arms up behind our back. Lots of different variations of that. And this is done with straight arms. And I'm like, okay, so that's a good stretch. But what I tried is, okay, I'm going to do the stick behind my back, lifting up, feeling that stretch. The narrower you grab that stick, the harder that becomes, okay? So I've got a rough idea of how wide I've grabbed that stick. And then what I did is I went and did some bicep curls on an incline bench. So I've set the bench to a low incline and I'm doing bicep curls. So the shoulders are in extension and I'm curling the weight up and then I'm taking the arms all the way down and the hands are behind my back. So it's that same position, but I'm going from a bent elbow to a straight elbow in this position. And then when I went back and I did the shoulder extension exercise, my hands were significantly closer and I could get the same range of motion. So let's say I'm getting my arms to be parallel to the floor with that, extension behind me with the stick. And I was just like, wow, that's like a huge thing. If I'd just done stick raises, I wouldn't have been able to get my hands as close together as that. But just because I went and did the bicep curls in between sets of that, the range of motion increased dramatically in that little gap. And I was like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, essentially the bicep curls just basically stretch the pecs a little bit and stretch through some of the limiting muscle groups a little bit. I thought you were going to say that you started the shoulder extension, but then you bent the elbows. So I don't know if you've tried this method. So let's say you have like the bar behind you, you're holding onto the bar, and then instead of lifting up with straight arms, you lift up with bent arms, and then you do a tricep kickback. So you extend the arms back behind you. This is a really nice progression for the stick lift as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, the bent joint to straight joint is a really nice way to educate the body, I find, on how to get into ranges. Yeah,
Massive.
yeah, I like that. I've never supersetted incline curls with shoulder extension though. That sounds like a nice little superset. I'll have to give that a go.
Yeah, give it a go, mate. I know how much you love bicep curl, so yeah,
I love biceps.
Yeah, I think the thing to think about there, or what sort of dropped for me there, is I think a lot of thinking here. But anyway, when we go to say middle splits, and this is one we can sort of talk about a little bit. Often when we stretch middle splits, we stretch middle splits like with straight legs. So we want to start in that middle splits, and we walk our feet out, and we might have a support or whatever it is we're doing, and we're just holding that stretch. And you introduced me to the bent knee middle splits. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit? And then I'll circle back to this shoulder extension and try to relate it. Why bent knee middle splits?
Well, when we bend the limb, or when we bend a joint, so let's say like either through the knee or through the elbow, it helps us set the if it's at the knee, it helps us set the hips into either posterior or anterior tilt easier. And if it's at the shoulder, then it's like the scapula. Like it can help us set the scapula into the more desired position with a bent elbow versus with a straight elbow. Basically, having a small bend in the joint or in the leg or elbow allows for a bit of slack in the chain, going up the chain and down the chain. So if I bend the knees, I can rotate my hips easier into anterior posterior tilt. Now we know that if we anterior tilt the hips harder and deeper, it will basically put your femurs into more external rotation, which then just allows you to get into a deeper middle split because there's less joint on joint or bone on bone restriction. Sorry. So bending the knees is like what I would class as a good educational kind of movement for people that struggle to set their hips properly and struggle to feel a good stretch. Like I've had people go into middle splits and be like, hey, I don't feel anything. You tell them to anterior tilt their hips and they can't, or they don't really understand how to do it. So you try and teach them with anterior posterior pelvic positioning, and again, they might struggle. And it's because they need something a bit easier. And a bent knee middle split, or a horse stance, or a Cossack squat are all very valid variations of ways to bend the knees while trying to abduct the legs, because it will help you get the tilt you need in the hips a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%. And it's like the Tailor pose is a progression that you might use towards the middle splits, because the Tailor pose is stretching adductors. But then when you do the Tailor pose, the knees are bent. Whereas when we're doing most of the middle splits, besides the bent knee middle splits, we've got the straight leg. And the other thing to take into consideration is the gracilis is an adductor muscle, and the gracilis crosses the knee joint, whereas the other adductor muscles don't cross the knee joint. So by bending the knee, we sort of put some slack in the chain, what you were talking about. And in terms of we take pressure off the gracilis, which allows people, so you might have a good Tailor pose. I've got a few clients that can get their knees to their floor with their Tailor pose, no worries. But then when you put them in a straight leg middle split, the range of motion is quite limited, because the gracilis is what they feel like. Oh, in a knee, like I just feel that. Like when I try to go into a straight leg, and then you do the bent knee middle splits, and they go deeper. And again, it just takes a little bit of pressure off the gracilis, and they don't feel the knee pain, but it just also allows them to relax and move into that middle split. Is something that I've found as well. And my idea around that is, where you go?
I was going to say that if the inner knee is the issue in terms of sensation, you want to be careful from when you go from bent knee to then straight, because basically you don't want them to bend the knee to overcome the pain, get into a deeper range, and then try and straighten the legs. Because if they do that, they're now straightening the legs at an even deeper range than where the pain was, and they're now putting even more load on the gracilis and the inner knee. So it's like, depending on the situation, because you can also have some people where you do want to do that. You want to bend the knees, get them deeper, and then try and straighten, but not if there's any knee issues.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, that's a good point to make, mate. Make it clear so we don't have people running away to do bent knee to straight leg middle splits after listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
It's not recommended for most people. Yeah.
Not if you're in pain.
But then my idea around that is okay, so we take the elbow joint, or let's take the elbow joint. We're talking about that shoulder extension and the shoulder joint. Well, we've got the muscles that run from the shoulder to the elbow. So we've got biceps there and we've got triceps. Now, some of the bicep muscles cross the shoulder and the elbow, whereas some of the bicep muscles only cross the elbow joint, and vice versa with the triceps as well. So when the elbow is actually in flexion, we're taking strain out of some of those muscles and potentially allowing the shoulder to sink back into further extension because it's bent arm. And then when we go to straighten the arm, it's like doing bent knee middle splits to straight leg middle splits. If you've got that capacity, then it can deepen that stretch or work us into a deeper range of motion. And that's sort of something that made me think, I thought about that when I was doing that. I'm like, okay, so there's this bit where some muscles are switching off and other muscles are switching on, and it's just allowing me to move into a deeper range. And then when I went back to the straight arm, it just opened up this range that wasn't there before because of the repetitions in and out of that incline bicep curl, which I found quite effective for myself. And I have actually done it with a couple of clients, and they've shown, oh, geez, I'm so much closer with the stick after I do those bicep curls. So it's been a good little superset.
Nice. Yeah. Tight pecs, tight biceps. Yeah.
It's a common thing.
Yeah. Very common.
Yeah.
Good way to approach it. Incline curls are a great value exercise.
Yeah, just so underrated. Even back in my strength days, I don't think I hardly used incline curls too much, and it's been only since I've started doing more sort of flexibility stuff and got into this that I do so many more incline curls myself, and I program so many more incline curls to my clients.
Yeah. Yeah. If somebody complains to me about having tight pecs, I instantly give them either incline curls or pec flies. They're like, wait, why are you giving me more pec work? Because you need to train it through more range of motion.
It's a good point you make. I think a lot of times when we've got an injury or a tight muscle, we're told to stretch it and we're told not to strengthen it. But the opposite is sort of true. It's like you think about a tight muscle, and it's a muscle
Well, no, it's both.
Yeah, it's both.
Yeah,
But it's a muscle that's probably not being used. So I think we talked about this before. You can think about like beef jerky. It doesn't have much blood flow going through that muscle. So when you start to train that muscle and you start to bring more blood flow into that area, it really helps to make the muscle more supple, and it allows it to, I suppose, come back to life and be a juicy muscle instead of being beef jerky. And it allows to increase the range of motion. So I'm on the same line as you. If someone's got tight pecs, it's like Poliquin chest flies, bicep curls, a lot of shoulder extension stuff, and it's more like repetitions than it is isometric holds. It's like, okay, let's get the blood pumping. Let's get that chest pumping.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's always a bit of a blows their mind at first. Like, why is coach giving me more like pec work? And then I think they forget to make the association of it being a loaded stretch. It's like if you give somebody, if somebody says I have tight hamstrings, and you give them Jefferson curl, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then they say that, oh, I have tight pecs, and you give them pec flies. They're like, wait, why? Because they associate the pec fly as a bodybuilding movement, and therefore as like a tightening movement, instead of it being like, oh, actually, I'm increasing my range. Whereas you give them a Jefferson curl, the Jefferson curl has an association with the movement culture and flexibility culture of helping develop flexibility. So they just have these like associations with the exercise and which culture it represents, as opposed to the exercise and what it is as a tool. That's one of the big issues.
Yeah. Another funny thing, and I got this, I've been watching some of Lucas Aaron's YouTube videos. You should check him out. He's been talking a lot about flexibility lately, and he just did one on like some of the origins of like way back old school sort of training. And it's funny because we have this idea that bodybuilders are stiff and tight. And if you go back and you look at some of the old school bodybuilders, and Lucas is really good at this, and he puts up a lot of pictures all the time, some of these guys are doing like front splits with a barbell loaded above their head, and they've got a chest to floor pancake, and they've got, such great ranges of flexibility. And somewhere along the line that got lost a little bit. And I think, the big guy was attached with, okay, this big guy can't move properly, or he doesn't have flexibility. But, flexibility, you can still be a big dude and still be flexible. And the other one is like, you see a lot of the Olympic weightlifters, like especially a lot of the Chinese, like these guys are friggin' strong and friggin' powerful. And you just think, wow, they just lift heavy weights all the time. They must be stiff. But those guys are doing like chest to floor pancakes with, 40, 50 kilos on their back. Like it's just ridiculous, like doing reps in and out. And some of their flexibility is just insane to see.
Yeah, definitely. I think back in those days as well, from what I understand, people weren't afraid of hybrid training quite as much. So like they would do a bit of bodybuilding, then they would do a bit of stretching, then maybe a bit of circus, and maybe a bit of hand balancing. And, like people were a bit more open to crossbreeding, let's say, of like different training modalities. But also, as we know, bodybuilding is basically loaded stretching. Like it just is what it is. Like every time you go for an eccentric movement with a weight, you're stretching that muscle group. So depending on how deep you go with your ranges and how deep you go with your reps will depend on how much flexibility you're going to be getting or not getting.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Any other methods, mate? What do you think of CRAC?
CRAC. I don't know what type of CRAC are we talking.
The Contract-Relax-Agonist-Contract method.
Contract-Relax-Agonist-Contract. You mean like you're not talking PNF?
No, it is really PNF. I think it's just the modern version. Like it's just been changed. Like it's been changed in that sort of sense. Although PNF is like the PNF is like you're contracting and then relaxing. Is the old school sort of PNF method. So it's like, what's a good example? Let's say the quad stretch. So you're doing the back to wall quad stretch, couch stretch, whatever you want to call it. You're in that position, and what you're doing is maybe you're trying to drive the foot into the wall. So you're trying to extend the knee. Now the quadricep is the muscle that extends the knee. So you're contracting that muscle nice and hard, and you might do that for 10 seconds, and then you relax that muscle. And then you might do 2 or 3 rounds of that. And that's the basic idea of PNF. But then this contract-relax-agonist-contract is going a step further. So it's then, okay, now contracting the opposite muscle. So let's go in the quad, that same one, with the same position, the couch stretch, trying to extend the knee and push the foot into the wall. So you do that for 10 seconds. And then once you come out of that, it's not relaxing and just taking a breath. It's now contract the hamstring as hard as you can to try to pull the heel towards your butt. So you're contracting the opposite muscle now. So it's like 2 contractions on opposite side of the joint. And I've been playing with this right now with my pancake. So one of my primary pancake exercises I'm working on right now is the seated good morning, chest to bench. And I've been using straight legs, straddle position, barbell on my back, so 20 kilos. And what I've been doing is going down into chest to bench. And then it's okay. So now I want to try to contract the muscle that I'm going to be stretching. So it's like, okay, hamstring. So I'm trying to dig my feet into the ground as if I'm trying to pull myself deeper by contracting the hamstring muscles. And then when I come out of that, it's the opposite. So now I'm going to contract the hip flexors and actually try to crush my face into the bench even more, or my chest into the bench even more, and do multiple contract, relax, agonist, contract on the other side of that. So that's not something I've played with a lot in the past, but it's something I'm playing with now, and it seems to be, helping. I'm making good progress. I'm starting to elevate the feet slowly as I work through this sort of progressive seated good morning chest to bench pancake.
The CRAC method.
The CRAC method,
I like it.
mate. I've taught you something today. This is good.
Yeah. So I mean, I never labeled this. I saw it as like having different cues in the set, but I never considered it as like you have. You've actually systemized it, which is pretty nice. So this is probably something you never did before, because you also weren't as in tune with the vocabulary and terminology of stretching in regards to how to like physically use your body to do things that you want to do. Whereas now you have, like, because you've done both of those things as separate drills in other areas of your training.
Yeah.
So now what you're doing is you're bringing them into like one big, like, epic mecha set where you can kind of do all these things in one set, and you can basically find your way down lower by using different contractions and different ways of relaxing yourself. So it's very nice for like slightly more, I don't want to say advanced, but just people who have the understanding of how to contract what they're trying to contract and have done these like individually before, and then they can put them into their main sets. But this one works really well as well with like partner stretching. With partner stretching, you can facilitate this a lot easier. I think we used to do it with the hip flexor stretch, if you remember the one that Emmett taught us years ago, the partner assisted hip flexor. But yeah, I never systemized it. I like it. I think you should label that quickly. And
I didn't make that up. It exists. Google it. It's there. Yeah. It's already a method. Yeah.
It's already a thing.
Yeah, I think Emmett talks about it too in some of his stuff too, mate. So
the CRAC method.
The CRAC method. You'll have to look it up.
Gonna have to. Yeah, I imagine it's being very expensive in terms of resources, though. In terms of like fucking mental resources, physical resources. Like it's not going to be a.
It's terrible.
It's not going to be a relaxed flexibility session.
No.
Yeah.
That's my intense session for the week. Like when that session comes, I'm like, oh fuck, this is gonna. And I'm doing a lot of scales in that, front scales and lateral scales, and my hip. That's another reason my hip flexors are smoked at the moment, because I'm working them a fair bit. So yeah.
So this session comes along, you're like, oh no, I've got to do a CRAC again.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That hip flexor stretch that Emmett teaches in his workshop. When I think I'd just done Emmett's workshop, and at the time I was training the sprinting team, the UK 100 200 meter sprinting guys, and one of the guys in there, he had such tight hip flexors, and like it was just ridiculous, because like he could sprint 100 meters in under 11 seconds or something stupid, and it was just like, how can he run so fast but have such tight hip flexors? But I remember putting him through that. It's like a hip flexor stretch. It's not like the couch stretch, but you've got a partner sitting on the back of your hips, and they bend the knee and pull up, and like he said, his hips never felt so loose after that. Like it was just like, but at the time he was just screaming like, Stretch, what are you doing to me? Ah! So it was a classic. Yeah.
I can imagine giving him the CRAC. Love it.
Giving him the CRAC. I think we've covered some good methods there, and that's probably enough to sort of share. Like, maybe we'll just dive into a few little like examples of maybe some other exercises or some stuff we've picked up along the way.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to share? I think you were talking about something about abdominal release. What's going through your mind with that?
Some of the deeper, darker secrets of flexibility.
Deeper, darkest, some of your dirtiest ones, mate. Tell us.
Yeah. All right. So, when was this? I mean, this was early 2020, like just before the pandemic. Training a guy, Irish guy in my gym, very nice guy. And he had the most horrendous shoulder flexibility that I've ever seen or ever worked with. And he wanted to progress to doing handstands. Normally, if somebody doesn't have great shoulder flexibility, they can still do a bit of a handstand. But like this guy's shoulder flexibility was so bad that he just couldn't even kick up against the wall because he would just instantly fall back behind his hands because he couldn't get the torso anywhere near of an angle to even get the legs up against the wall. Not that he wasn't strong enough or coordinated enough, he just literally didn't have that flexibility. Whereas normally a non-flexible guy kicking up against the wall, they'll have an arch in the lower back. Anyway, I was like, okay, cool. So we've got some work to do here. Let's start with some shoulder flexibility work. And I just gave him the standard stuff. Things that we'd been taught, if you want slightly more flexible overhead position, you need a bit more flexibility in your lats, a bit more in your pecs, a bit more in the biceps, some external rotation work. I gave him the full package for everything because like everything was failed when I tested all these ranges. Nothing improved, or like there was a very marginal, very small improvement. I was like, what is going on? This is really weird. So I did what I would do in these situations, and I sought out from Emmett Lewis, my master guru at the time, so he still is. I was like, hey, Emmett, look at this guy. I was like, can you help me out? And he's like, so you've tried all the normal things? I'm like, yep, tried all the normal things. He's like, okay, let's release his intercostals and his abdomen. I was like, what? He's like, just give it a try. And he sent me a video of some like manual release work for the intercostal muscles. We gave that a go. So it was like using your hands manually to like try and manipulate some of the fascia underneath like your bottom rib. It's quite interesting actually. But the idea is you're just trying to just like give yourself a massage on the stomach. So we tried it, and instantly there was like some progress in his range, in his overhead flexion. I was like, this is interesting. He's like, okay, now do the hip flexors. So then I did some hip flexor release work with him. So I did the couch stretch and then the psoas stretch. So up against the wall, foot up against the wall, just trying to stretch through the quads and then trying to stretch through the deeper hip flexors. And there was like more improvement in the range. And I think we got it to the point where he was like, no lie, I've got a picture of it. He was almost at like probably a 45-degree angle, maybe a little bit higher, let's say 45, and then you come up a little bit higher, about 50. It's probably about 50 to 55 degrees. And then he went all the way up to not the full 90. No, yeah. Assuming hand out in front of you is at 0 and arm up all the way to the top is at 90. I suppose we should be working with the 180, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It went from like 55 probably to about 75. I think the closest we got him to was like maybe close to 80 degrees in overhead shoulder flexion, like very close to that 90-degree mark. Not fully there. He didn't stay with me long enough to get the full thing. But we did this by basically just releasing through the abdomen, through the intercostal muscles, and through the hip flexors. And then I was thinking about it a little bit more, and I was like, yeah, this makes a bit more sense, because if we look at overhead flexion, it's basically an expression of the anterior chain. But then we also have the fascia along the front of the body, where if that fascia is sticking, if it's not releasing, it's just not going to allow you to even stretch the pec. Like, it won't allow you to get into the pec stretch if the skin on top of the pecs and on top of the stomach isn't giving you enough slack to do that. So then if we release the fascia through the whole anterior chain, going from the quads to the hip flexor area, to the stomach, to the higher abdomen intercostals, it then provided a lot more slack in his chain, which then allowed us to get higher, which then allowed us to actually do the shoulder specific stretches. So it was like, this is like the concept of what you were talking about earlier, like with the onions and the layers in the onions. It was like that, but to like, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 layers. So this guy would have needed a lot of time before we could, get this a bit more like confident. But we managed to express a lot of flexibility in just a few sessions. He was the type of guy that booked sessions with me. I think he was like doing one-to-ones, but um, he didn't do it for too long. I think we had him for a couple of months, and we were making some good progress. And then some life stuff came up, and he wasn't able to continue. But yeah, this for me was like a huge eye opener in terms of what shoulder flexibility can actually entail, and little things that we'd never even consider.
Yeah. It's just that layers, like you say, mate. It's like finding that outer layer. Like, where is that outer layer and where do we need to start from? Because for some people, it might be pec and bicep that's limiting shoulder flexion. But for other people, like you say, it's further out than that. And hip flexors, abdominals, like all that sort of stuff. That anterior chain, like you said, has a big role to play. So yeah, that's a pretty good story that you share there, mate. I mean, we could talk about that like on so many different levels. I think one other example is like we could talk about the forward fold or the middle splits and like hip rotation, internal, external hip rotation, like what's going on inside the capsule, like really deep inside the capsule and how that affects your ability to even fold forward. And I've seen this like firsthand working with clients. Like if you get them to do like, let's say an RDL as the first exercise and say, okay, video the RDL, show me the RDL, they do that. And then the second exercise is, okay, let's work on some hip internal rotation or let's work on hip internal rotation and let's work on stretching the external rotators. And they do that and then they go, okay, now go back to the RDL, and the range just dramatically improves between the first set and the second set because you've opened up space in the hip capsule. So that deep layer allows them now to get a better anterior pelvic tilt and sink deeper. And it's not just the hamstrings. Like, someone might be struggling at the RDL and think, oh, I've got tight hamstrings, I can't get deeper. But you open up space in the hip capsule and all of a sudden they go deeper and you didn't stretch the hamstrings. So it's like just so many different layers as we talk about, and having the ability to sort of explore and play around with different concepts and different ideas to see, okay, well, what is the layer that is holding you back from going a little bit further in terms of the range of motion?
Yeah, I think flexibility has a really nice engineering component to it. Takes a bit more time to like get your head around, and also takes some extra time just where it's not really spoken about and everything's very new. So, but once you do, and once you start seeing the layers for what they are, you're like, oh, okay, now I understand why this is opening, this isn't opening, what we need here, what we need there, etc. But then obviously you then got that all in conjunction with the environment, with the surface, with the mindset and frequency and normal strength programming and periodization. Like, it can get quite complicated and very overwhelming at the beginning, but it's not magic. Like, this is the thing, like it makes sense once you understand the variables and once you can put them into the picture and put them or into the factory and press start and slowly go through one layer at a time until you get to where you need to be.
Yeah, 100%, mate. So many gold nuggets. Look at that. And only an hour and 20 minutes in. We could go all day.
We could. Is that how long it's been?
Yeah, that's it, mate. We might call it ends there, eh? I think we've covered a fair bit there. I think it'll be quite good. What's plans for the future, mate? In the short term for you, what's happening?
Quick trip to Venice, a bit of a family holiday type trip. One of the very few holidays I'll actually take off in the year where I won't do any work. There's only a small one. It's I think like 4 days. Never been to Venice, so that should be interesting. I'm also currently on the Candida diet, which means pretty much 0 carbs. So it's going to make this trip to Italy a lot more interesting.
That pizza and pasta, mate.
Yeah. But other than that, I don't have too many plans. Like this winter, I think I'm just going to knuckle down with some work and projects and hopefully do a few more of these podcasts with you. That'll be good. Maybe we can get a few more in over the winter. Although it's your summer, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah, it's
your summer, my winter.
Yeah. Any projects? Any projects you want to share with us, mate? Anything you're gonna give us a sneak peek at, or?
At the moment, I'm trying to finish my foundations programming. I don't know if I mentioned it yet. I've just been a little bit slow at putting the programs together, but it's basically flexibility, body weight strength, and hand balancing it's the combination of them, but on the foundation level. So it's like for beginners who want to get into this stuff, but they're not too sure how, what they need to work on, how can they put the programs together, etc. So it'll be like a nice cheap introduction to my type of online coaching, but without a lot of the one-to-one work. It's here is the programming. It should last people for like a good 12 to 18 months worth of work, but it will get them to a place where, okay, I can start to feel some balance off the wall, and I can start to get into like close to a pancake or a middle split, and I can do some chin-ups and dips. Yeah.
Nice, man. Sounds good. I like it. Yeah, I've just finished redoing my core compression and forward fold flexibility program, which is my little freebie on the website. So if anyone's looking at increasing their core compression strength and forward fold flexibility, jump on tstmethod.com and download the free program. I think it's about 6 phases, but they're just like twice a week, and they're short sessions, just like 15 minutes. You can tap them on the end of your strength training or your conditioning training. And I've been busy building a pistol squats program, and I hope to have that out in the next couple of weeks. So I've been rebuilding my own pistol squat, so it's getting much better, which has been good. So uncovering some new exercises, exploring some new ideas, and just build all that into a program which will be out soon. So that's taken me up, and I've also been working on a chin up and push up program for a little while now. So I've been revamping that, and hope to maybe try and get another phase of that out before the end of the year. But we'll see how it all ties in, mate. I've got a trip to Tassie planned for a mate's wedding coming up, and that will be like a week where I take off as well with hopefully minimal work. Telling my clients going away for a week, don't annoy me. I mean, don't send me too many videos, and just enjoying that time. So it should be quite good.
I was looking at Tasmania on Google Maps the other day, and it looks so different to Australia, like completely different infrastructure, like different, architecture. The buildings look different. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, mate, that's definitely worth getting down there. It's a cool part of the world, and I'm looking forward to getting back there. It's been a long time since I've been there, but yeah, like the hikes and the walks and everything out there are meant to be fantastic. So we're going to be doing some of that when we're there, which will be great. Yeah.
Send me some pictures.
Yeah, we'll do, mate. We'll do.
Of you doing some crack. I want to see you doing crack in the mountains.
I'll do some crack in Tassie. For sure. All right, dude. I better let you go. Great to chat, and thanks for sharing your secrets with us.
Yeah, likewise, Stretch. Thanks for sharing the good stuff.
All right, stop.